Now, primarily, there are three important ratios that you need to understand. The three ratios are tracking error, information ratio, and Sortino ratio. So let's understand the first one, that is the tracking error. A tracking error basically measures or is used to describe the standard deviation of the difference between your portfolio return and your benchmark return. So let's say that there is a portfolio that gives an X amount of return and has a graph like this. However, your risk-free rate of return is like this, or your benchmark's return is like this. Now, what is a tracking error? A tracking error is the error or the standard deviation that is occurring over here, right? So there is certain deviation from its path between the original benchmark and your asset that you've chosen, and that is what is measured by tracking error. So a good security or any good security is one having the lowest or the least tracking error. So always choose an security with a least tracking error. The formula for tracking error is summation of your difference between your return on the portfolio minus return of your benchmark whole square divided by n minus 1, right? This is a formula for tracking error. The next ratio is an information ratio. Information ratio is not that widely used. However, it is a very important ratio. Information ratio, the formula is given by expected return or difference between the return of your chosen security and your chosen benchmark divided by the tracking error itself. This is one formula that is used of information ratio. Another formula is your active return divided by your active risk. What it kindly denotes is that it divides your extra expected portfolio return as opposed to the tracking error. So information ratio is a great return ratio. Basically what it says that how much are you earning more and how much less deviations are occurring. So information ratio, it should be as high as possible because return is higher. So as high as possible, your return is greater, your risk is lower. So information ratio needs to be high. And the last ratio is also called as the Sortino ratio. Sortino ratio formula is given as follows. Sortino ratio is equal to the return of your security minus the minimum return that is required divided by the downside deviation. Now, what do we mean by downside deviation? Downside deviation is actually nothing but a type of a semi-standard deviation. What it measures is the variability of only those returns that fall below a certain minimum acceptable return. So for example, let us say a security has 8% return, 6% return, 5% return, 12% return, 16% return, 23% return, 3% return. So let's say if your minimum acceptable return is of 8%, then a downside deviation basically takes into account 1, 2, and any if there's any other ratio that's lower than 8%, yeah, 6%. So these three ratios it will take into account and measure your downside deviation. It does not bother with any return that is above your minimum acceptable return. So that is the formula of Sortino ratio. So let's do a problem. The problem states that there is an active portfolio manager who's trying to currently beat the FTSE 100. Now, the expected return that the active portfolio manager expects on his portfolio is 15%, which is given to us, and the return on the benchmark is 12%. The tracking error that has been given to us is 9%, and the minimum acceptable return is given to us as 4%. The downside deviation is given as 7%, and now we are expected to compute the information ratio and Sortino ratio. So information ratio is nothing but expected return on your portfolio minus expected return on your benchmark divided by your tracking error, right? So this then comes to 15%, which is 0.15 minus 12%, which is 0.12, divided by 0.09, which is your tracking error, 9%, and this amounts to 33%. So information ratio is of 0.33. And similarly, if we measure Sortino ratio is equal to your return on the portfolio minus minimum acceptable return divided by your downside deviation. So which is equal to your return on the portfolio is 15%, minus 4%, which is your minimum acceptable return, divided by downside deviation, which is 7%, which is equal to 1.57. And this is how you solve problems on these three ratios.